All right, thank you everyone for joining us for today's DANS Data Trail, how the EOSC Association stimulates community-based open science. It's 3:31. We're just going to wait a couple minutes as I see the waiting room is still unfolding everyone. And yeah, as Micah typed in the chat, keep your camera and microphone off during the presentations unless you're a speaker, but feel free to use the chat for any questions or remarks. Yes, and Wim would like to point out he is the Chief Technology Officer, not the entire office at DANS. I mean, you can keep dreaming, Wim. So, let's see. I think we can wait one more minute for others to come in, and then we will get started. Hold on. Do not lock the meeting. All right. I will just give a few more minutes as there was a little technical issue. All right. The waiting room came back, so we're going to ditch the waiting room. Welcome, everyone, and we'll slowly start in a minute. All right. So with that, we are going to start today's DANS Data Trail, how the EOSC Association stimulates community-based open science. My name is Kim Ferguson. I work here at DANS, and I'm very happy to be hosting today and introducing you to our topic. And just a reminder, we are recording. So with that, just some housekeeping. You can keep your microphone muted and your camera off during presentations unless you are a speaker. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat during the presentations. You can also use the raise your hand function on Zoom, or you can use your microphone during the panel question discussion or when we ask for questions. Other than that, probably a good idea to be muted. Note that these event presentations are recorded and the presentation will be published, and all of the authors have given their permission. Also, you're welcome to tweet about this event. You can use our DANS handle there on Twitter. And please don't take or publish any screenshots of the participants without asking their permission. So with that, just a little bit about DANS. So this is our building here in Den Haag. DANS is a research data service provider in the Netherlands based in The Hague. At present, we have around 60, 70 people working at DANS. And we are an institute that is funded by the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Science Council, NWO. So our mission has always been to promote and provide permanent access to digital research resources. So while we are a national center of expertise, we are also involved in or leading multiple European-wide projects, including those that are associated with the European Open Science Cloud, or EOSC. Additionally, some of us at DANS are part of the EOSC Association Task Forces, which you will hear more about today. So today's schedule is a bit full, but hopefully very interesting. So we're already in part one. I've already welcomed you here. And then I will shortly introduce you to the introduction from Sarah Jones of the EOSC Association and the task forces and what they're about. Then we will have an update on some of the task forces that DANS is involved in. And then we will have time for questions, both in between each, as well as a large panel discussion at the end. And then we'll wrap up before 5. So with that, I'll introduce you to Sarah. Sarah Jones is the EOSC Engagement Manager at GIANT and Director of the EOSC Association for 2021 to 2022. As Engagement Manager, she works with national research and education networks and provides support on open science. In her previous roles, such as the one of Director at the Digital Curation Center, She fostered training, consultancy, and community building, as well as international connections on which she readily builds to broker new contacts and collaborations. Sarah was also a part of the European Commission's Fair Data Expert Group, which produced the prominent Turning Fair into Reality report. And today, Sarah is here to introduce the EOSC Association and the task forces. So I will give it to Sarah.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thanks to everyone who's attending. So I'll give an introduction to the association and what we're hoping to achieve through the task forces, and then we'll hear specifically about what's going on through the Dutch contribution through different DANS members. Now, I don't know why that slide's not advancing. We tested this before. There we go. It's moved now. So to begin with the purpose of the association, the EOSC Association was set up as a legal entity to enter into the partnership with the European Commission for the EOSC initiative. And it has three key functions. The first one is to provide the single voice for advocacy and representation of the broader EOS community. So we're a membership organization. We have different universities, different research infrastructures, publishers, e-infrastructures, and we're there to really try and give the voice of that community that's engaged in EOSC. We're also there to promote the alignment of European Union research policy and priorities with the different activities that are coordinated by the association. And the third one, which I think is the most challenging one, is to enable seamless access to data through the interoperable services that address the entire research data lifecycle. And the reason I flag that one as challenging is because the EOSC Association is really the kind of governance and coordination and the membership organization, but a lot of the implementation happens both through EOSC projects, and which I'm sure many of you are already in, but also through the different research infrastructures and through the institutions where research is going on. So to try and enable that seamless access is difficult because we're having to try and work very closely with the projects. So this is the association today. This is from our General Assembly, which took place in May. There's a large number of people in the association. 163 members and 78 observers coming from all across Europe. We do have some international members as well because EOSC isn't a silo. We need to collaborate across the globe where the challenges on data are very similar. But as you can see, it's mainly research performing organizations and service providers. So the key people who are really dealing with data and providing the infrastructure and support. We also have a number of funders that are members of the association too. And we have a very good spread across Europe. There are some countries where we have higher representation, the big players like France and Germany and Italy. In some countries, there were actually many more institutions, so individual universities that signed up as members as well, and that affects the split. But with the work we do within the association, we try to make sure that all the different countries are represented evenly, regardless of the kind of inputs they have on projects or the infrastructure they have in place. And that also affects the way we've put together the task forces, because we've tried to have even membership across the task forces as well. So to come on to an introduction of the task forces, this is really the way that we drive the community inputs into EOSC. So the task forces are a structure to allow the different association members and others to help steer the implementation of EOSC. And those task forces, they all define their own remit or charter, and with the work that they're doing, they're to liaise with the projects, with the key people who are implementing EOSC, and to try and provide feedback and advice on the approaches being taken. And the task forces are also a really important part of contributing to the strategic and research and innovation agenda. So the SRIA is the main document that comes out of EOSC Association that identifies the key areas that need to be worked on. And we collaborate with the task forces to draft that SRIA and consult with them about what the key gaps are and what needs to be developed next. And that in turn influences the Horizon Europe work programme and the new projects that the Commission will be funding. Now, it's not only members of the association that can be part of the task forces, the groups are also open to externals. And that's really important so that we can draw in the wide range of expertise that's needed. And within those task forces, they're also structured under advisory groups, and there's a board liaison per advisory group based on the expertise we have on the board to try and help feed into the different task forces and offer the advice that's needed. So there were 13 task forces set up altogether, and this is really the brain pool of our community that we're trying to feed in to steer the implementation. So over 400 volunteers in total, and a number of Dutch stakeholders, specifically from DANS. And what we're going to hear about today is 3 of those task forces. So I've highlighted the ones where we'll hear more about the actual work that's been going on. The technical interoperability of data and services from Vim, semantic interoperability, the fair metrics and data quality from Marian, and long-term data preservation from Ingrid. But there's a broader set of task forces as well. And I think we've got some people on the call who are from different task forces. So hopefully we can maybe tease out some of that in the discussion. In terms of what the association's hoping for from the task forces, I think really, I mean, the task force itself is a very strong pool of the community. But we also want to try and ensure that the broader community also has an input to how EOSC is developed. So trying to help the task forces work in a collaborative kind of community engagement approach is something that we've been pushing for. So for the task forces to be releasing documents, consulting on those, to get feedback on their plans and validation from the wider community, but also to encourage people to take part in the work. And I think one of the examples we'll hear from the Fair Metrics group is how they ran hackathons. So that's been a good way to get the broader community involved. And as I've said, those task forces are really trying to provide governance steers that can guide the implementation of EOSC. I think that worked very well on the previous governance and is something that is likely to happen again with these new task forces. And they're also helping us identify new areas or bits of work that need to be done. And that can continue because most of the task forces run for a couple of years. We can have extensions of the charter or new charters developed where work still needs to go on in a specific area. So some areas we're working on, like data quality, are really quite new within EOSC, and there'll be like a broader program of development, I'd expect. One other thing I wanted to flag that the association's recently released is the Eos Forum. This is a community engagement platform to let people find out about work that's going on in the association and let them engage with the task forces and with wider projects. The task forces are just onboarding their groups now and starting to use this as an area through which they can kind of convene their work. And I think this will be rolled out more widely to the community too. And the other thing to flag that's coming up is the EOS Symposium, which will happen in November in Prague. The call for papers for this actually closes tomorrow if you're wanting to submit papers. And we should have a program out in the coming weeks. But that's a good way to hear more about the task forces, but also about the wider developments going on in EOSC. And I think that passes on to either any questions or to the next presentations. So I'll just stop the remote control and hand that back to Kim.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. Any questions for Sarah right off the bat before we go on to the first update? Always give a little bit of a leeway, but I don't see one right now, so maybe you have one in the back of your mind and we'll bring it to the panel discussion. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
So our first task force speaker is Marian Grootveld. So Marian leads the research data expert team at DANS. In the European Fair project, she led the synchronization force, which organized workshops for many European research initiatives and projects to align international activities on the journey towards more fair data. She continues the synchronization activity in the recently started Fair Impact project. Marianne is also reviewer for the International Core Trust Seal Board, which certifies repositories as being trustworthy with a capital T. One of her mottos is "Fair data live in trustworthy repositories," which makes it exciting to be part of the task force Fair Metrics and Data Quality. So, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Kim. And thank you, Sarah, for giving us a foundation for focusing a bit more on these task forces. In the spirit of reusing and doing that fairly, I can tell you that most of my slides come from presentations made by other people. The co-chairs of this task force, Carlo Lacagnina, who's also available in presence today, and Mark Wilkinson, and my former colleague at DANS, Ilona von Stein. Next slide, please, Kim. Thank you. You may gather from the title of this task force that we are, in practice, two branches: a fair data, a fair metrics branch, and a data quality branch, and both deal with challenging notions. When you look at the cartoon on the left-hand side, my data are fair is very easily said, but it's very hard to substantiate it because no one has the definition of what it is. And in a sense, similar to data quality, Sarah already mentioned under EOSC, less work has been done on that topic. But it seems that quality very much depends on the context that the data is used in, or that someone wants to use the data in. And it also depends very much on the stakeholder and perhaps the discipline. So challenges enough. And as I said, we're fortunate to be led by two co-chairs, Mark Wilkinson and Carlo Lacagnina. The link to the charter for our task force and the other members is there, and the members, as Sarah said, will also pop up in the new forum. Next slide, please. What we aim for in this task force is to oversee the implementation of fair metrics for the EOSC. I'll tell a bit more about the metrics on a later slide, but core to this approach is that we want to test them with research communities, and that the scope of the task force foresees in the charter that we will focus on implementing and testing them. We were not going to define them or to redefine them. That certainly, it might be challenging and attempting to do that, but it's not what we are for. And concerning the data quality aspect, we're looking at more general aspects in the context of the EOSC, but also in relation to communities. Next slide, please. I will start now with the first branch, the fair metrics part of the task force. And the image you see is the cover of an important report, Recommendations on Fair Metrics for EOSC. It was the product of an earlier EOSC working group on fair data. Sarah was one of its members, crucial members, I can say. And what we do now, of course, is to build on the recommendations in that report and others, with one element very clear in our mind, that the success of those metrics will depend on uptake by the communities. I mean, it's brilliant to come up with principles. It's very hard to be against those principles, but the actual success will be in practice, and that needs uptake. For that, we want to know more about how uptakeable they are in a sense. So the metrics and the fair data assessment tools are crucial in that respect. Broad consultations with many disciplines. And as all task forces, I think we will make recommendations how things can be improved and can be applied in practice. Next slide, please. I think we have two key challenges. The first one is really to move from the principles to sensible metrics. And to give you an idea about that, and I should make very clear that this is not work done by the task force mainly, but already by others. Steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 are not even all the steps, but I think this suffices to give you an impression if you haven't dealt with the challenge yourself. Originally, there were principles launched in 2014. And under item 1, you see one of these findability principles, findability principle 2, specifically, data are described with rich metadata. Now, you may be familiar with the existence of an RDA working group on the Fair Data Maturity Model, and one of the many things that they did was split up the original 15 principles in metadata principles and data principles, because many of the original principles had very neatly this meta in brackets and on data. But that's, of course, very hard to measure. So that's why I made the M in the name RDA-F2-01M. That is the metadata version of that findability principle 2. In a further step, there were lots of initiatives building on this fair data maturity model that try to make it even more specific so that you can really measure it and assess whether those properties are available. For instance, the Fair is Fair project did that. They reformulated the same principle for the metadata side, that it would include descriptive core elements, the creator, title, data identifier, and so on to support data findability. All of this was already there or nearly there when we started as a task force. But more needs to be done to make it fit for automated testing, because the question then arises how to give a certain weight or a certain score to this metric. And don't forget, we have many more metrics. For instance, you could argue for this specific formulation at point 3 that within the brackets there are 7 elements, so perhaps you should score a maximum of 7 points for this on your data set. Clearly, that is still pretty arbitrary, and that is the main challenge I wanted to mention first. Different tools from different initiatives will make different choices, on how to interpret the principle, how to assign it a weight for testing or passing the test, which ends up with different scores. The second challenge then is, of course, the sense making. So what do scores mean? And on a very on a broader term, what do the principles mean in different research communities? They may differ between, let's say, the more hard sciences and the very soft or historical research areas. Next slide, please. What we've done so far in this part of the task force, we submitted a report on the so-called apples to apples workshops. Sarah mentioned the term hackathon. There have been workshops or hackathons where the designers and developers of, let's be fair, competing fair assessment tools sat together. For those not familiar with the expression of comparing apples to oranges, it is an idiom that you can use when you compare very different things. And clearly we hope to reduce the differences between the different tools. So at least let's see if we can compare apples to apples. And we're certainly not at the point that we only have one EOSC apple, but there's something to hope for. The second thing we submitted to the board of directors of the EOSC Association was a white paper about the governance of the principles. And I put a quote on the slide, which I think is core in the white paper. Actually, there are more task force members in the audience, I think, so they may have different opinions, and we'll see about that in the discussion later on. I think that the statement, the FAIR principles represent a milestone in the evolution of scholarly data reuse and likely should remain untouched as written. So they are not for changing. I see a comment in the chat. The white paper is not out. I understand it's under review with the board of directors at the moment. Certainly it is something that should be public because we need feedback on that. But to continue with the quote, the idea is that the principles should remain untouched, but that specialized domains, disciplines, should be able to extend the principles to make them more relevant for the community. So much about the first branch of the task force. Next slide, please. The data quality part is the second branch. There it is essential that we find out the relevant quality dimensions relevant for the different communities. It is pretty clear from the information that we looked at and the conversations that colleagues in that part of the task force had, that the attributes and dimensions of quality can vary across disciplines, but also even within disciplines. And then it needs to be seen what is useful to take up for EOSC, what are the commonalities across disciplines. And that part of the task force also will make recommendations for quality assessment, focusing on reliability and reusability of data, and also on who stands to benefit from the better data quality. Next slide, please. Also, they run a survey in last spring. There were more than 150 full responses to the survey about data quality. You see on the map that responses came from different countries. They also came from different kinds of organizations with a focus on academia and research, and many research disciplines were included in the responses. Next slide, please. The survey, or the outcome, I should say, is being used to come up with recommendations, but there were some insights that I can share with you today. On 4 of the questions that were part of the survey, the information that the respondents consider most important for properly using or selecting a data site. So we're talking here about existing data sites. And from the answers, you can see it's essential that it's clear how you as a reuser or a potential reuser can cite those data. The data need to be scientifically accurate. There should be terms of use, good versions, clearness about formats, compliance with metadata standards, and so on. All of these things need to be there for people to properly use existing data. Asking them for questions about what their community was lacking, the core notion was agreed, controlled vocabularies and terminologies. So a bit related, I think, to the metadata standards mentioned under the other question. And the metadata seemed to pop up as a connecting element, because also in the area of practices and tools that a discipline should have to assess the maturity in data quality management, metadata standards come out first. Agreed definitions, metrics, interestingly, to quantify the quality. And when you look at answers to the question about the level of data quality management that people expect from EOSC, there are requests, or there is a need for some basic curation, sanity checks on the data content, documentation, the availability of metadata and documentation. There should be basic checks on metadata compliance. And a very interesting property, I think, is that it should be able to users or reusers, how you want to call them, that they comment on the data quality, so that you could have a kind of community metadata in addition to the more formal metadata. I think that brings me to the end of this part, indeed. When there are urgent questions and there's time, according to Kim, you're very welcome.
I do have time for one question, and there is one in the chat from our colleague Slava. Do you have some ideas about fair metrics related indicators to evaluate data infrastructure in general without datasets metadata itself? For example, if infrastructure supports persistent identifiers or is able to keep provenance information.
Thank you, Slava. I think this links also to the insight that many of the FAIR principles, FAIR properties, you could even say, are also, or even primarily, properties of repositories. So part of the infrastructure, the service infrastructure. For instance, it's typically a repository that provides the persistent identifier to a data set. So some of these principles, it might be more efficient to assess or measure what a repository does than what a data set brings along. So definitely some of the metrics could also be assist in quite another way, and that is being done to some extent in guidelines for trustworthy repositories, but those worlds are converging, but we're not there yet in the sense that it's all in place. But I think that could be a way forward to measure at the right level and perhaps not at the data site level. Does that answer your question?
Well, we'll have to see. Yes, Slava says yes. All right, excellent. So next, well, we're going to go to the next panelist. Thank you, Marianne, and we'll come back to you when we have the discussion. So next is Ingrid. So Dr. Ingrid Dillo, is Deputy Director at DANS. She holds a PhD in history and has worked in the field of policy development for the last 30 years, including as a senior policy advisor at the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science and the National Library of the Netherlands. Among her areas of expertise are research data management and the certification of digital repositories. Ingrid is the co-chair of the Research Data Alliance, or the RDA Council, and is a member of the board of directors of the Core Trust Seal and DataCite. So Ingrid is also, of all the hats she holds, is the coordinator of the Horizon Europe project Fair Impact and a member of the EOSC Task Force on Long-Term Data Preservation, which she will give us an update now.
Thank you very much, Kim. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the task force that is looking at long-term data preservation. Next slide, please. By the way, I make grateful use of some slides from the co-chairs of this task force. The topic of this task force, long-term data preservation, I think often creates confusion and misunderstanding. Terms like bit preservation, data curation, storage, long-term archiving are very often used quite interchangeably and also sometimes seem to mean different things for different audiences. Now, of course, bit preservation forms the basis of long-term data preservation. Making sure that the bits and the bytes survive is, of course, the basis. They need to survive threats like media obsolescence and bit rot and any natural or human-made disasters. But we also know that bit preservation is clearly not enough. We need active curation to keep the data not only accessible, but very importantly, also accessible, interpretable. Now, curation involves preservation, but also elements like selection of the data, appraisal, ongoing maintenance, and enhancement of the data. So people who look after the data, data curators, should also facilitate the use and the reuse, hopefully, of data sets, and they need to interact with creators and users to achieve that. They need to maintain documentation. They need to also establish linkages with other resources. So there's a lot more to it than just making sure that the bits and the bytes survive. And it's also important to stress that it involves adding value to digital data throughout their life cycle. So not only at the end of the active life of a data set. Now, if we are able to take care of all of that, that would mean that the data will be more easily found, will be better understood, and hopefully also more reused, and in that sense also lead to a bigger benefit for the wider society. Next slide. Thank you. So I think this makes it clear that a first job for this task force turned out to be to create that common understanding of the field that we are talking about here. So when we speak of long-term data preservation, we mean active preservation. And the word active is important here, I think. So we need to do that to ensure that the data retain their value and remain fair for a defined community, for a designated community, and also for a longer period of time. And it also includes ensuring the authenticity of the objects. And for that, we need to track the provenance, managing and recording the changes to the data over time. And we also need to avoid unintended changes. We need to make sure that the integrity of the data is secure. Now, having said that, if we then look at the European Open Science Cloud as it is now, we see that long-term data preservation did not receive a lot of attention, I think, in the policy discussions, and also not in the thinking about the service provision within that European Science Cloud. There has really been a strong focus on FAIR, and of course that is rightly so. But I sense that things are changing now. There is more interest and more focus on long-term data preservation, but still we need to cover and overcome many challenges. And you see the main challenge that we see for this group here on the slide: the management and preservation status of data and metadata across the European Open Science Cloud are not always clear. And the policies and practices across services that care for data are not always transparent and consistent. So there is still a world to win in this area. Next slide. Here you see the objectives of the task force. The task force will look at a number of more or less interrelated areas when it comes to long-term data preservation. The first one, and I already talked about that, is the feeling that this task force really needs to create that shared understanding and vision for sustainable preservation in the European Open Science Cloud. That means that we need to define the functions that are necessary to create and curate and store and preserve data, and also how we can engage with data users and reusers. So that is a big chunk of work, and it has become, it is very clear that also within that task force, if you have people around the table, that everyone comes from a different angle and everyone has their own understanding and interpretation of this field. And that in itself is already a strong signal, I think, that there is a lot of work to be done to come to a shared vision. So that is topic number one. Topic number two is about mapping and promoting the roles, responsibilities, and also the accountability with respect to preservation and the actors that are involved. We have seen that making sure that the data survive for a long term involves many people and also involves the whole research data lifecycle. And at this point in time, we don't have a clear picture of who should do what. So we have a very firm basis to build on. I think it was last year that the Digital Preservation Coalition in the UK published a report that was commissioned by the European Commission that is called Fair Forever. And in that report, they really gave a wonderful overview of where we stand with respect to roles and responsibilities in this area. And also they presented a lot of recommendations for different stakeholder groups to take into account. So that is a firm basis for this work. And the idea is to work from there and come with recommendations to make sure that these roles and responsibilities are understood and are also taken up. A third aspect is the financial aspect. And that one is, of course, also related to the mapping of roles and responsibilities, because nothing happens for free. And it's very clear that if you want to really take good care of the data over the longer term, that involves a lot of funding. And maybe not so much funding of material costs, but even more so funding of human resource, because curation is about actions of actual people. Also here, there is some kind of a basis. I think it was 2018 or 17, maybe even, where when a OECD report was published on sustainable business models for repositories. So that is a good starting point. But of course, it's not only about repositories, it's also about the financial aspects of all the work that needs to be done by the researchers themselves. So this is a big chunk of work, and also a quite challenging chunk of work in the sense that the long-term data preservation involves a lot of human resource, and that is expensive. So the big question, of course, is where should that funding come from? We know that, for example, repositories have a very prominent task in the long-term preservation, but we also see at the same time that a lot of repositories depend partly, and sometimes for a very big part, and sometimes even completely, on incidental funding, and that is a big issue. Then finally, the fourth topic is the topic of let's say, the professionalization of digital repositories. The task force plans to come up with recommendations on the creation of a European network of trustworthy digital repositories. And the idea of that network would be to promote, but also to mature the repositories in their approach towards the preservation and fair enabling practices. And we want to promote that across disciplines and also across geographies in Europe. Next slide, please. Since I am part of that subgroup, a few words about that specific strand of work. So we believe that such a network would bring several advantages, not only to the repositories themselves, but also very much to the whole of the European Open Science Cloud. And you can see some of them here on the slide. So for example, such a network could help maintain the fairness level of European research data over time. Like I said, there is a strong focus on making sure that we get fair data sets in Europe. And of course, you want to keep those data fair. And that requires that they live in a trustworthy repository, a repository that has a certain level of quality that can take over custody of those data sets and keep them fair over time. And the network could provide a very good basis and opportunity for less advanced repositories to make use of the knowledge that is available in the network at other repositories. And the idea would also be to provide training between the different repositories to enhance their capabilities with respect to preservation and fair enabling capacities. Also important, creating a network would make it possible to create better connections with the data services and technology providers in the European Science Cloud, and the network would also provide a single and unified voice for repositories in all the policy debates around the European Open Science Cloud as the key stakeholders that they are. Next slide. So here again, you see the structure of the task force. On the upper right corner, you see the two chairs, Roxana Wijns from the University Leuven and Hervé Loers from the UK Data Service. And you see the four different subgroups dealing with the four topics that I just described. The one on the common understanding and vision is led by Christa Loof, the mapping and promotion of roles by Mariusz Modjanski. Mapping of the financial aspects is led by Paul Stokes from JISC. And finally, the recommendations for a network is led by Didi Lamers from our own country, from the Radboud Universiteit. Next slide. So where is this task force at the moment? It's very important to say that the task force has made it quite explicit that they will not come up with very detailed outputs. They really want to stay at the general level and make use of the outputs that come from the different projects and initiatives that are going on. And they want to lift that to a higher level and come up with recommendations on the basis of what they learn from those outputs. So they do not aim to create new content or new initiatives. The first phase has really focused on gathering information, mapping stakeholders, doing desk research, also discussing amongst ourselves this common vision on long-term data preservation. We have had several stakeholders presenting in the different meetings, and we've also been interacting and aligning with other task forces, because there is of course a lot of overlap with the other ones. Next slide. And all of that has now come together in a draft paper that the task force is creating, and that is, I think, at the moment on the desks of the EOSC executive board. And you see here a snapshot from the Google Drive. The structure of it is again reflecting the 4 sub areas. And once this paper gets approved, we will reach out to the wider community to get feedback, and we will take it from there. And then at a certain point in time, of course, it's time to come up with recommendations. But this is the picture of the situation now. And I think with that, I'm at the end of my talk, and I hand over again to Kim. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ingrid. So we have a question from Carlo. So, more than where should the funding come from? Could it help to also conduct cost-benefit analyses? I mean, not every single bit needs to be preserved, and not forever. Consider what to preserve and for how long would reduce the costs. I think there's a question mark at the end there, but yes. Oh, Ingrid, you're muted.
Sorry, I was too quick. I was just saying that is a very good question. And of course, that is a bit of the elephant in the room. I think the selection of data that need to be preserved is a very big topic that we do not very often talk about, but that we should talk about, because everybody knows that we can't keep everything forever. So it should more or less start with that discussion. I also think that looking at the cost-benefit analysis is very important. I know that we have had some projects also trying to get a grasp of that. It is also, of course, very domain-specific. There are areas where it's very clear that you can just get rid of the biggest amount of data that are being produced, and that you don't need to keep a lot. It depends very much on the domain and the subdomain. So that also means that it's up to that is a discussion that should take place in the different domains. But it will certainly not be a plea for just, endless funding to keep everything that we produce. Although I'm a historian, so I like to keep things, but no, I completely agree with that comment.
Great. And I see Wim has a follow-up answer to everyone, which is great because Wim is the next speaker. So I invite everyone to read Wim's follow-up, and then I will introduce him.
That is exactly what I meant. I mean, you have areas where you have data that can never be reproduced, so you want to keep them earlier on than those enormous volumes of data, raw data that come from machines. So it differs. Yeah.
Great. All right, thanks so much. So with that, I'm going to give an introduction to Wim, our final panelist, before we start getting really hard questions. So Wim Hugo is the Chief Technology Officer for DANS, and he focuses on the provision of high quality, state-of-the-art digital repository services. He's responsible for the maintenance and evolution of DANS information technology services. So over the next several years, Wim will oversee the transformation of DANS activities in this field, ensuring that it remains user and stakeholder focused and integrating it with national, regional, and global e-infrastructure initiative. DANS intends to establish an increasingly visible profile in the domain of e-infrastructure, architecture, services, and software. So VIM specializes in research data infrastructure architecture, open science policy and implementation, and then the development of policy and decision support systems based on open data. VIM is interested in all aspects of interoperability, but the technical aspect is he finds the basis for all other aspects. So with that, I will leave it to Vim.
Thanks, Kim. So maybe we should move directly to the next slide, which attempts to classify the activities of the different EOSC Association Task Forces in terms of their contribution to different flavors of interoperability. As you can see, there's quite a few of them that will contribute one way or another to organizational interoperability improvements. There's one very specifically looking at semantic interoperability, and a few that contribute to technical interoperability. And I'll be talking specifically today about the technical interoperability of data and services and what that task force sees as its scope of work. So on the next slide, just a quick introduction that within technical interoperability, there's generally thought to be two strands of work. One has to do with the syntactic aspects of interoperability. That's the syntax that we use when we invoke services and methods in the web. So essentially things like standards about protocols and APIs and so on. So that tells us how to engage with the service or resource in the web. And then the schematic interoperability side is also still technical, but that tells us how to exchange information with that service or API or protocol. And note that it is not only necessarily a question of receiving content or data or output from such a service, but also potentially providing configuration information or parameters or input data and so on. So that's more or less the scope of the technical interoperability task force's focus. At the bottom, there's just maybe a little bit of additional perspective to say that typically, if we think about the way in which we want to engage with services from a machine actionable point of view, we typically would want to know how to invoke that service through a protocol, for instance. We would like to know what kind of format our response would take and what the expected schema for it would be. But what we're not focusing on in this working group is what it means to us. And that is the subject of the Semantic Interoperability Task Force's work. So on the next slide, quite predictably, as with many of the other task forces, this one also starts with some form of landscape assessment and overview and scouting. There's quite a bewildering number of existing services and guidelines and best practices and recommendations created by services, by initiatives, by projects within the EOSC landscape and internationally. So we've started on this process sort of from a top-down perspective and dividing the work amongst the willing and able. And we're happy to say that we will at least have a first version of this landscape assessment ready sometime in October. And the deliverable is essentially split into two now, because we've also thought to publish some thoughts on the methodology that we are following to establish this landscape assessment. And I'll say a little bit about that right at the end. And this subtask is coordinated by Eva Siacha. On the next slide, there is a focus on the data aspects of technical interoperability, things like data, metadata formats and interfaces and access protocols that are in use by the EOSC stakeholders. But I think what is quite important here is that one of the outcomes that we're looking for is to specify a minimal set of functionalities or methods that should be available for machine interoperability when we are engaging in respect of things like data and metadata. And this is coordinated by Philip Wieder and Juan Masso. They're only aiming to have something finally ready by October 2023, but I suspect that there will at least be some interim deliverables for the community to provide feedback on way before that. The next slide, there's also one that looks a little bit wider at the supporting services in EOSC. This can be quite a wide variety, dealing with things like search and discovery facilities, access provision and brokering, analysis and visualization services, high performance computing, and so on. So it's a very, very broad church to investigate. The coordinator there is Damien Andrew Tamburi, and they're also aiming to finish their work by October with no doubt some interim deliverable to obtain feedback and input from the community. Next slide, please. Then I suppose, as is the case for most of the other task forces, there is a intent to produce recommendations. The coordinator is Alvaro Garcia, and they need to finish their work, their final deliverable by November 2023. And I think this will be foundational for many of the other interoperability efforts, because, of course, for other aspects of interoperability, one also needs the basis of technical interoperability before it can become accessible through machines. Next slide, please. A little bit more about the methodology that is looking to become a deliverable, or at least a publication on its own. On the left-hand side, there is the sort of first cut of assessment of technical interoperability of product, or let's say the outputs or the contributions produced by services, products, initiatives, and projects. So the typical aspects such as descriptions and whether projects, for instance, have a start and an end, and which domain they serve, what their focus is in terms of what they talk about or provide. And then, quite importantly, what the readiness level of these outputs are. Sometimes it's just a concept, sometimes it is running code, so with anything in between. So it will be very good to categorize the state of implementation, as it were, of these resources that already exist within the scope of the task force's work. And then also added to that to understand whether it is already part of EOSC in one way or another or not. So that's our initial intent in the landscaping assessment. But we have elaborated that simple schema quite a bit. There's a sort of a snapshot of it on the right-hand side. We're aiming to build this into something that is a living resource and that anybody essentially can contribute to. So there are resources already available. For argument's sake, the Open Research Knowledge Graph developed at Leibniz Institute, that one could use for something such as this, as a living resource that uses a formalized schema to annotate resources in the web, in this case with the intent of identifying and classifying and understanding the technical interoperability resources that are available to us. And that's it from me, I would say. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Wim. Does anyone have a question particularly for Wim at this moment? I'll give the floor a minute, furious typing. Otherwise, I do have a question for you, Wim. So what is the next challenge in interoperability, would you say?
Yeah, it's probably not technical interoperability. I think there's two challenges. The one is semantic interoperability from a machine point of view. especially for data, is one of the big remaining challenges. And there's been a lot of focus on semantic interoperability of metadata. But to my mind, a lot of the potential automation in future will depend quite strongly on the extent to which we can make data semantically interoperable. So that, I think, is a big new frontier. Everybody, I suppose, are aware of it already, but not much work is really being done on that. Yeah, and then the other aspect that I find interesting in a way is that we have legacy research outputs, and then we have future research outputs. And the way we should be working with these are quite different in my view, because it's relatively easy to ensure all kinds of interoperability for future research outputs that we are producing, but I don't see that anybody's going to take care of retroactively making our legacy research outputs interoperable in the same way. And that's sort of almost like, let's say, the part of the iceberg that's below the water, that we are not always fully appreciating and could be quite costly. So we need a sensible approach to over time converting our legacy outputs so that they're also interoperable.
Perfect. Thanks so much. All right, so that's for VIMS. Now, the final section of the panel is actually on semantic interoperability. However, Andrea, my colleague, Andrea is a senior researcher at DANS, and she's a member of the EOS Task Force on Semantic Interoperability. But one of the many hats that Andrea wears at DANS is as a Polyphonia Consortium member. So right now she's in Paris for a network meeting. And she sent her regards, and she gave me these 3 slides to present to you. So because these slides will be sent around afterwards with the recording, you can look more closely at what Andreas talked about, as well as get in touch through the EOSC Association website to see who the leader of the task force is to get more information. So I have nothing for you, but these 3 slides. So here you can see linked the charter of the task force for semantic interoperability, and this infographic comes from that charter. And so they operate on an open membership principle, and the members are listed, as well as they have devised 3 themes: metadata standards, metadata catalogs, and use cases. So they have also already come up with a clear path that they're going on. And so here, from a white paper that they are currently working on, Wim has already used the similar infographic to talk about the layers of interoperability and where does semantic interoperability be thought of. But really, semantic interoperability cannot be thought without the other layers because they are so intermeshed with each other. So Andrea says the main outcomes so far from the Semantic Interoperability Task Force are that the theme groups meet regularly, and they're currently working on 2 concurrent white papers. The first is a landscape overview. It shouldn't be a surprise after hearing from the other task forces. And 2 is crosswalks, minimal metadata set, and interoperability indicators for a method frame. So with that, I will say that's the very brief taste of what the Semantic Interoperability Task Force is working on. If you want more information, I would suggest getting in touch with their chair. But yeah, and thanks for Andrea for coming up with these slides along with her fellow Semantic Interoperability Task Force members. So with that, we're going to move on to the panel discussion. So I'm going to invite all 4 panelists back to turn on their camera, turn on their microphone, and face some questions. And I'll stop sharing so we can see everyone. All right, Ingrid, Wim, Marianne, and Sarah, we're all back. So the first question I have for all of you, unless I see any questions from the chat, let me be a nice host and no, I don't see any yet. Okay. So the first is, what do you hope will come after the end of a task force? So what do you envision your results to be implemented and taken up, and by whom? Feel free to jump in at any time if someone knows the answer. Otherwise, I would love to hear from all 4 of you.
I can begin with a kind of general response if you like. I mean, I think from a EOSC Association perspective, what's really key is that the recommendations from the task force are implemented. And as I mentioned before, there's kind of this slight split between the governance, the association, and the implementation that's happening in projects or in national initiatives. So I think it's really trying to get the community consensus from those recommendations and actually making it easy for them to be put into the kind of work plans and programs that people are using. And I think we're starting to get more of that synergy now, because there's a lot of people from the different projects on the task forces, and, you know, like with the Fair Metrics example, they've picked up and they've tested things like the Fuji tool that had come out of Fair's Fair. So I think it is more kind of reciprocal, but that's certainly one hope.
Yeah, I think looking at the task force that I'm involved in, that I agree very much with Sarah, also because I have a project hat on. My hope is also that there is more alignment and coordination between what the projects do and are going to do, and what the task forces come up with in terms of recommendations. I think it's very important that in those task forces, we also make the connections to the national level, because we need to realize that in the end, the EOSC is the conglomerate of what we do and what we have nationally in Europe. So that connection with the national level and even the institutional level is very important. And with respect to this particular topic, I also hope that the outputs of the task force will help raise the voice of the repositories and the importance of long-term data preservation within the whole policy debate in the EOSC.
Great. Marianne or Wim?
Well, one of the things I hope for, perhaps more on a personal level than as being a member of the task force, security. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When we meet researchers and scientists, or also data stewards, for instance, in trainings or in projects, there is still a lot of confusion about EOSC, about its ambitions, about what it means for them on a regular Tuesday. And what I hope is that the task forces, the recommendations and the implementation of the recommendations will lead to more clarity, less confusion, less competing offers sometimes, and also the understanding what it does mean for the individuals and the teams that do the actual work. I mean, all of us talking about this are in a sense service providers. We're not the researchers ourselves. And the security I hope for is the feeling of security, of knowing what to do, knowing what is expected of you when you are, for instance, this early career researcher, or also the team leader, who can sometimes feel very overloaded with expectations from the top, the funder.
All right. And Wim?
Yeah, I would say maybe slightly cynical, but you know, one would hope that what comes out of these task forces don't just become part of the landscape analysis of the next round of things that we do. So somewhere along the line, we've got to start making use of these recommendations and guidelines and best practices and patterns for architecture and whatnot, and try and measure to what extent they are actually adopted in real running software or in repositories and so on. That's very complex because it's a wide variety of things that come out of these task forces, a bewildering array, in fact. But I mean, one will have to make some attempt to try and determine the extent to which these things become real in the world of implementation.
All right, thanks. So my next question is actually for Ingrid, because you mentioned that the financial aspect of long-term data preservation, and we're based in the Netherlands. I'm just curious what the general need or appetite within the Dutch research landscape is and what is currently on offer, and if that could be changed, or how do we do here? But also DANS is a data storage provider. So what does that mean for us?
I don't exactly get your question, Kim.
So one of the aspects of the, well, what is the need for long-term data preservation in the Netherlands?
By the researchers, you mean?
Yes.
Well, I think always that there are, if you look at long-term data preservation, of course, sometimes towards researchers, it's a hard sell. Researchers are doing research. They are getting credits for doing research and publishing. And the long-term preservation of their data might not be the first thing they think about, and is also not the first thing they get credits for. So looking at it from that perspective, I think that the attention that is now being given also in the Netherlands towards redesigning the way in which we measure research and we appreciate research is very important. We need to incentivize researchers to take better care of their data, manage their data in a better way, also to make sure that we can keep them over a longer period of time and make sure that they stay understandable. But I think it's not something that each and every researcher is thinking about on a daily or a monthly basis. On the other hand, we see that funders and to a certain extent also publishers maybe, but funders do see a lot of added value in the long-term data preservation, because it also makes the return on their investment bigger. And there is, of course, the idea of having the data available that is also good for research, because we can build on each other's work, etc., etc. But I do not think, I think that we first need to change that whole research assessment structure before we can really say to researchers, this is something that you need to invest in, because we also need to make sure that that is reflected in their academic career.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Not completely an answer to your question, but
No,
anyway.
Perfect answer. So then the next one I have is for Marianne. So you talked about comparing apples, but you also mentioned briefly you don't want to discuss if there's only one apple left. Do you want to go into that further, or what happens when there's only one apple left, one fair assessment tool left? Can there be only one?
In theory, there can be only one, definitely. In practice, I don't know. I think it depends very much on how you see EOSC, and also about on your own character. I think when I consider myself as a taxpayer, and I am a taxpayer, I would say when one tool suffices, let's do that. Let's not put more money in other things. But of course, I know there will be resistance, not only in the Netherlands, typically in the Netherlands, but also elsewhere, I suppose. So that is what makes me not believe that we will end up with only one apple. I don't think that in EOSC there will be one repository, one fair metrics tool, one, I don't know what kind of tools or equipments you all use in your disciplines. That is very unlikely. So, but theoretically, yeah, why not?
Sarah, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I can come in on this as well from a kind of policy and governance perspective. I think it's very difficult within EOS for us to recommend a single one thing of anything, whether that's one repository, one tool, because research practice is so different. And when we're looking at like fair metrics, as Marianne flagged in her talk, the tools will evaluate things in different ways and put different weights on different things. And, you know, that will affect the score that different communities get from the tool. So I think it's very problematic to come down and kind of recommend just one thing, because we may not get comparable assessments, and that's the kind of work they've been investigating so far. So I think, you know, maybe it's not the most efficient way to go, but I think we have to look at the different developments and maybe recommend a couple of options rather than just a single thing. and essentially allow the community practice to dictate what's appropriate.
All right. Any other from our panelists want to join in? Or I see nods. Nods are great. But you both agree, I think.
Yeah, maybe if you've ever looked at music albums on Wikipedia, you'll see that there are 5 or 6 different ratings from different perspectives for the same album. I think we're not going to be any different. We must make sure that those different assessments are provided in a consistent way to the end user so that they can make up their own minds.
All right, great, thanks. So one question actually for Sarah is, how can people contribute to the TFs, or how do people get updates on their progress? We've talked about white papers, like what is the best way to get the output from here?
Mm-hmm.
Or contribute?
So I think one key thing is joining up to the EOSC Association newsletter. That's an easy way to get regular updates. Task forces act in different ways. So some of them will put out different papers for consultation or run things like the hackathons. And that's a way for people to engage in whatever events or consultations they're running. But there is general news coming out of the association as well. So that's a key place to get it. And as I said, the Eos Forum, something that's only just been launched and just been used by the association and task forces so far. But I think there will be more mechanisms for the community to engage at large. So watch this space for that.
All right, great, thanks. My last question, and I'll still, like, everyone in the audience, feel free to ask questions. I do have one for Ingrid, Wim, and Marianne, and that is, this is the DANS data trail. So I'm just curious what you can see the connection between DANS and these task forces, either what DANS can take away from what these task forces come through, or what DANS can add, just kind of whoever wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to give it a try. Practice what you preach, right? So, are the data in the DANS repository fair? Well, that is the wrong question, because fair is not a black and white thing, so either or, it's always a gradual thing. The DANS repository was part of fair metrics assessments like other repositories, so in that sense we practice what we preach. The next thing, of course, is when you get your score and whatever the narrative that comes with the score, how that resonates in your repository policy. I think we can do more there. We are doing more than a couple of years ago, and we will go on. So in your opening slide on what DANS does, you mentioned the repository as a versatile one, and Wim and his team work on better functionality and for the communities. So yeah, we are in that sense practicing what we preach. The data quality aspect, I think that is not so much perhaps for us as a service provider to improve. I think that will depend strongly on the teams and the individual researchers who entrust, who deposit their data with us. Yeah, so let me stick with the domain from the task force I represent today.
Great, thank you, Marianne. Wim or Ingrid, want to join in?
Well, I think if you look at the topic of long-term data preservation, of course, you could say that is at the heart of what DANS is about. We provide a long-term data archive. And we have been doing so for a long time. If you look at the predecessors from which DANS originates, we have data that are, I always remember that exactly, because the data, our oldest data, are just as old as I am. They come from the same year. And that is a long time ago. So we have a lot of experience. And I think being active in the European arena gives us the possibility to share our experience, but the other way around also very much we can learn from others, and I think that is a very important aspect of this European collaboration. It's also good to hear people talk about topics that we think we know a lot about from different perspectives, that also makes you aware of the, you know, that everything is relative. It sounds like an open door, but that is really, if I look at it from a personal, on a personal basis, that is what you get from, that is a big benefit that you get from participating in these European endeavors. And that is a big value in itself. That is also very valuable, I think, for our own organization.
Great, thanks. Wim, anything to add or?
No, I was going to say more or less what Ingrid was conveying, that it's a learning and sharing experience first and foremost. You know, we can learn a lot and validate our ideas and adjust our models of how we see things working by talking to other experts that have different ideas about how it should work, but also share what we have found to be working well with them. So, and of course, I mean, I'm a great believer in, to some extent, managing diversity so that there is better efficiency. And that's what EOSC is about for me, is not to limit initiative completely. You always want new ideas and a bit of diversity to have resilience in a way, but it's very costly to have completely unmanaged environment. You know? So from a philosophical point of view, EOSC is the right idea for me. So I like it a lot.
Great, thanks. So I don't see any other questions in the chat and I'm out of questions. I would like to ask the panelists, do you have any questions for each other that came up during your presentations? No? All right. Well, then with that, I'm going to quickly share again. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I want to extend a very big thank you to Sarah for joining us as well as our introduction. And thanks to Marianne, Ingrid, and Wim for being our panelists today. And thank you everyone for joining. So we do have a survey that you can fill in about today's data trails. And I'm going to try to throw it in the chat. If possible. Boom. And I will stop recording now.